me booming out. Awesome. So I am going to start by saying I'm not an expert on symbols in Jewish symbology, I suppose. I'm not, Dan Brown's, whatever his name is from the Da Vinci Code, walking through and being like, yes, the history of this. So I have some things about symbols. And in particular, what I wanted to talk about today is I want to talk a little bit about symbolism and mysticism, because and yes, sorry, Robin, I will provide handouts by email after this. I'm going to screen share so that you can see it, and we'll be reading aloud. So it'll be a post-class email. Thank you for asking. So I want to talk a little bit about Jewish mysticism and symbolism today, in part because I think that that's something that not a lot of people spend a lot of time with, but it's a wild, wild place. The Kabbalah, if you've spent any time with it, is it goes there. So before we start that piece of it, though, I wanted to get onto the table, and I'll write in my little parking lot. Are there symbols that people are particularly curious about? With no promise that I can answer it now, but I can make sure to get you an answer if I don't know it. So are there any particular symbols that people are most interested in?
I did deliberately wear my necklace. I know that one comes up so often.
It does indeed.
Robin's bringing up various menorahs, the different branches.
Yes.
Hamsa from Jess.
Yeah. Okay.
I think Star of David. Mm-hmm. I think even you'll see seasonally the shofar one and reflected in different pomegranates. And there we go. Jess was asking, why is the Star of David sometimes called Solomon's seal?
Great. Awesome. And maybe we can talk about symbols that are not symbols that have taken on more meaning than they actually hold, which is always a super, sometimes symbols become overdetermined of like what they're supposed to mean, and actually they don't mean that at all. So that's as useful as these sort of like really layered symbols. So great. So we can talk about those first. And in some ways, and one of them I actually might save until for the last, because it would be a nice transition into talking about Kabbalah a little bit. So what I want to start by saying is that I was thinking a little bit over the past few weeks, I've been thinking about like, well, what makes a symbol versus something else? And I think that like a symbol versus a logo, right? And so to me, a logo is something that's supposed to represent exactly what it is, right? It's supposed to tell you this is insert. This is Netflix, right? You see the big red N, you're like, this is Netflix. You see the red, white, and blue with the white squiggly in the middle, you're like, oh yeah, it's Pepsi, right? So it's not to say that logos can't, right, have lots of different applications or meanings they can't take on things, but generally it's supposed to represent exactly what it is. And as I've been thinking about symbols, especially in a Reconstructionist context, right, symbols are in some ways very specific, but also deliberately vague. They're meant to take on and can hold many pieces, and they're not necessarily specific to one context or one cultural context, I guess is how I mean to say that. So a great example of that is the Hamsa, or the evil eye. So these are symbols that come out of an the Eastern context, right? This is something that in the cultures that Israel is coming up in, that evil eye is something that lots of people are worried about. Right? But we have taken it on as really a part of what's going on. And sometimes you'll see that inside of the Hamsa. Another name for a Hamsa, does anybody know before I say it? So in some traditions, it's called the Hand of Fatima. And Fatima is actually Muhammad's wife, right? So there is a wife, daughter. But I'm gonna put a plug in that because I don't want to misspeak, but what I need to say about that is that it's actually, in that case, not a Jewish symbol necessarily, but something that gets used by lots of different cultures to mean things. And part of that is because even how you orient the hand, the chamsa actually gives different meanings of what it's supposed to do. So if you see a chamsa with the fingers up, take a wild guess as to what that means. And feel free to like use voice if you want to, or you can type it in the chat.
Yeah.
But if the chamsa is up, what can we imagine it means?
Good luck. I've
Ooh, that's
seen that with
interesting. Good luck,
elephant
bad
trunks.
luck. Oh, interesting.
That's
Elephant trunks, good luck, bad luck. Okay, that's interesting. And like, who am I to say? This is one interpretation, right? But this is a common interpretation, is that if you see a hand like that, it's telling you stop.
Oh.
Right? If you have a hand like that, talk to the hand because they don't want to listen, right? This is the chamsa of protection, right? Because it's actually pushing out things. As opposed to if I were to come to you like that with the fingers pointing down, that is a hand of nurturing, right? That's a hand of giving. And so sometimes this is called, excuse the binary, I'm just giving you the history, I'm not, right? Often they will say the masculine and the feminine chamsa, which I don't really love, but in like the bigger, broader context of the patriarchy, right, we have this idea of the masculine protection, we have feminine nurturing. And so that gets taken up and gets used all over the place, but not a specifically Jewish symbol. And actually we'll get to the Star of David and which is surprisingly actually originally not a Jewish symbol either, which is just a funny thing. And I'm seeing all of these awesome things about Solomon's seal in here, which is great. So you're already thinking through those things, which I love. It makes my presentation a little bit easier. So the menorah and the Chanukiah is actually also sort of a funny reason why we have two different ones. So the menorah is a specifically Jewish symbol. So in the menorah, which just means a lamp, right? The menorah is specifically the lamp that God tells the Israelites to build, right? So if you look at, sometimes you'll look at different representations, because it's all people imagining what it could look like. Because if you actually look at the description of building the menorah, it's very confusing as to how you would actually put it together. At least I think it's very confusing. And it's talking about, well, it has to have this many almond blossoms and calyxes, and this needs to connect here, and they all need to come out of the same spot, right? And so originally you're like, all has to come out of the same spot. So is it like one point has all these branches off of it? And eventually they come up with the one where it's the pole that has the cups coming at different heights. But so that's one of those things. The Chanukiah is actually kind of odd. The reason the Chanukiah, or one reason the Chanukiah looks different, the menorah specifically for Hanukkah, is that in the Talmud, I don't have the citation for where in the Talmud, but I can find it for you, is because the rabbis ruled that the menorah of Solomon's temple could not be used outside of the temple. Even its representation couldn't happen outside of the temple for use. And so they modified it. They modified it to fit what they described as this miracle of the sufficient oil, which is very interesting. And so there's actually a really great, there's a great story about how many people you could do it by a show of hands, or I guess whatever you want to do in terms of an emoji, if you want to do an emoji, because I think it can recognize it now, can it?
Yeah.
It can, great. How many people start with one candle and go up in number? Okay, yeah. Most people, yeah, great. How many people, does anybody do, I know not everybody has their camera on, so that's okay, but if anybody in the chat wants to put it, did anybody start with all their candles lit and go down? So there's a story in the Talmud. It's a machloket. It's an argument between Hillel and Shammai, who are these two very famous. The story most people have heard of is about the convert who comes and says, "Teach me the entire Torah standing on one foot." Those guys. And so they have an argument, a machloket, about whether or not you're supposed to start with one or you're supposed to start with all, and which way you go. And so that argument is in and of itself a symbol of what are we trying to symbolize when we're lighting the menorah. So yes, we're trying to talk about this miracle, but more than that, we're actually talking about what do we believe about holiness. So Hillel says we never decrease in holiness, and that's why we should start with one and go up in number. And Shammai says, no. There's actually a part in the Torah that says we start with this number of sacrifices and we go down. So actually, it's in the Torah that we decrease number. And eventually, this voice comes down and says, Elu ve'elu, this and this, both are the words of the living God. You're both correct, which is very unsatisfying for everybody reading. But we're going to do starting with one, the house of Hillel. And the reason for that is not because it's right. It's because Hillel teaches both ways to all of his followers. So it actually comes down with respecting difference. And so I love that, this idea of these polysemous symbols, these symbols that have lots of different ways that you could do them and do them correctly, but not necessarily not the same way, but a valid way. It's very interesting. The shofar and lulav and pomegranate. So shofar and lulav those are very specific. Those are specific to Judaism, and so those come up in different ways. Shofar is interesting because we talk about spiritual awakening, but it was also used in times of war. That's what they would use to indicate that they were going to war. So it's do with that what you will about what that means for spiritual awakening. And the lulav is specific to the holiday of Sukkot, which happy Sukkot, everybody, Chag Sameach, I'm so sorry, Simchat Torah, Shmini Atzeret, all the things, Zman Simchat Tenu, the time of our joy, which is great. Pomegranates are weird. I think they just like that they had a lot of seeds.
Well, there was the one comparison, there's 613 seeds in the pomegranate.
Yes.
I heard that one.
Yes. So, and we're going to talk a little bit about the rabbis love numbers. If you're a mathematician, the rabbis are the people for you. They love numbers and they love figuring out how they go together. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about that in terms of Kabbalah. So I'll save that piece of it. But pomegranates are also included in the yield of Israel. So this idea of fruits that are specific to our people. And in fact, there was a suggestion by early rabbis, which is, it's funny that it becomes a symbol of 613 mitzvot, the things that we are and aren't supposed to do, because originally the fruit in the garden they thought was a pomegranate. And so it's actually not until Christian painters begin painting the scene of Eden and of Chava taking the fruit that it gets taken out to be an apple. And part of that has to do with Latin. So the word for, I feel like I'm talking a lot. So if you know this, just jump in. Does anybody know the word for apple in Latin?
Like palm or palme?
Was that?
Pomme? Pumme? I think that's
Yeah.
When French and Spanish is
Spanish is manzana.
That comes from a different place. The word in Latin is actually malice. It's M-A-L-U-S, which is why we have malic acid, which comes from apples. And malice also is related to the word malum, which is bad. So what did Eve do? A sin. So what did she pick? A malice, a bad thing. And so pomegranates can hold those things. Marsha, you said that the Talmud teaches that you cannot use a traditional menorah outside the temple. What is different about the menorahs that we see on the bima? So, great question. So we would normally not use those for a mitzvah. is the difference. So we use them decoratively, right? But we wouldn't, or we might have them, like sometimes synagogues will have them on the wall with like bulbs, or something like that. Using it for a decorative purpose, right? This question between is it a symbol, is it a ritual object, gets a little bit funky. So my understanding is that it's okay to use it decoratively, it's not okay to use it ritually, because that would be something that we would only use in the temple, is my understanding of what's different about using them on the bima. Cool. Yeah. And I'm actually, do you have a pen? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm gonna write that down because these are awesome questions. I prepared what I prepared, so I want to make sure that people have awesome. Thank you. If people have questions, that I can find it. So I'm gonna find the citation in the Talmud where that happens. Before we move, oh wow, it's already 1:30. So before we move to the Magen David and to the Star of David, one thing I did want to say is like a symbol, if we want to call it that, but a symbol that I think is overdetermined is the kippah. So a lot of people, right, are taught that if it drops on the ground, oh, you got to kiss it. That's not true. And part of that is because we're trying to lend like an extra piece of holiness to it. But there's actually, there's a rabbinic ordinance that you're supposed to wear a kippah when you're eating or studying or anything like that. But there's nothing in Torah that tells us we have to cover our head in that way. And so it actually comes from, the context of how deference was shown, either to kings, or in a cultural context where people were covering their head, which became very common in Christian and Muslim communities eventually. And so there's a sense that happens there. So sometimes it's funny how much power symbols take on, even though they actually don't have the same, they don't have the same foundational stuff happening. So that's what I mean by a symbol that like doesn't quite work. Or that's overdetermined. Whenever I watch a show where a family has their menorah on a shelf, my family and myself get a good feeling. We could connect to this object in the mirror of our lives. Yeah, absolutely. I call that a glimmer. They make garments out of fig leaves. Oh, I love that. That's interesting. I heard the rabbis of the Talmud said the forbidden fruit was the fig because after eating it, they made garments out of fig leaves. I love that. So this is a great moment where ambiguity actually leads to a lot of interesting questions. And so I have not heard that. I will steal that. I'll quote you. I'll say, Julian said on that the rabbi said. So so thank you. I actually hadn't heard that, but that's really interesting. Yeah, the fact that we actually don't know what it is makes it very interesting. Like, was it an etrog, right? Mm-hmm. Like that would be very interesting. And what would it mean for it to have been an etrog, or what would it have meant to be, hell, a banana? I don't know, right? They're like, what do these things hold? And there's a theorist named Frank Kermode that I really like, who talks about midrash, and says that the important thing about midrash is always being made and interpreted in the time that it is, and so that is also obviously very much part of this reconstruction or reconstructing. Is the sense that we are in our own cultural context. So if we were to pick the fruit, like what would we have chosen had we not been in that cultural context? So that could lead to really beautiful and deep theological things, or maybe there was a pomegranate grower who really wanted to spice up their trade. I don't know. But the fact that both could be possible is very interesting, and unfortunately not always traceable, but what can you do? So I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna take a sip of coffee because I want to give people, if they have questions or they're sort of processing stuff, or they have whatever, that you have time if you want to write it in.
That should-
Palm looks like a crown on top. Oh, love that. That's amazing.
And head of the year, Rosh Hashanah, you just see it so much around that.
Yeah. I mean, there are some cultures, there are some like Jewish communities that do fish heads.
Yes.
Fish heads and pomegranates and all sorts of different stuff to sort of represent. Yeah.
It's a combo.
Yeah. It's food stuff is also always a very interesting, that's a whole nother symbol system.
I recently saw on Etsy, of course, just a dangling necklace, and it was a little gold challah, just a tiny inch-long challah, and then they also have matching everything bagel earrings. So.
Matching everything bagel earrings, that is spectacular. I'm into that. I love that everything bagel seasoning. And like, let's not pretend that is not also in and of itself a symbol, right? Of what it means, thinking of the own symbols that we associate with Jewish life, and love to hear that. For me, it is a kippah, right? So I'm talking about a kippah like, oh, it's actually not that important as I wear a kippah. So take it all with a grain of salt, but that is what that is. So the Magen David, okay. So we did not discuss the Kiddush cup. Not discuss the Kiddush cup. In what? Just in general?
As a symbol?
As a symbol?
It's also such a traditional, like, isn't it a very traditional, like, bar mitzvah gift? And like a welcome thing, like everybody has to have one.
Yeah, Kiddush cups, I can't say I know a ton about why that particular thing comes up. There was something in the temple called a libation offering, which was a liquid offering. And so that might have to do with this idea. So it's the same reason, or one of the reasons I should say. So a lot of people, when we eat challah on Shabbat, does anybody what have people heard about why we sometimes put salt on the bread?
Other than yummy, I don't know.
Other than yummy, I love it. It's delicious, sure.
I'm gonna guess.
Because that was, I'm sorry, when they were in the temple, they would use salt when they were sacrificing an animal, as I understand.
Yes. So yes, perfect.
So it's reminiscent of the days of the temple.
What was that?
Reminiscent of the days of the temple.
So it's right, yeah. So okay, so great. So yes, it is reminiscent of the days of the temple. And so that's one reason why people put salt, is because you salt offerings. That's part of making an offering, is you put salt on them. But something weird happens. And the thing that's weird happens is that other than Shabbat and like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, what's the holiday that everybody knows? Passover, 100%. So Passover, yes? Okay, at Passover, we dip karpas, right? We dip the karpas into the salt water. And the salt water there is to represent bitter tears. I saw somebody just now, yes, bitter tears, right? So something really interesting happens where something about this Pesach piece of it and something about the Shabbat piece of it comes together. And people say that the salt at Shabbat tables is also to represent our people's tears, right? So this is a weird moment where we see symbols sort of encroaching on each other. And sometimes that means we lose a piece of the original meaning, or it gets forgotten completely, or that more than one thing is able to take the place of sort of these overarching narratives about what we believe about our history. So there's a very famous, he was writing in the 1950s, I believe. There was a very famous Jewish historian named Salo Baron. And Salo Baron talks about the lachrymose understanding or the lachrymose perspective on Jewish history, which is to say that often when we're doing or talking about Jewish history, we have a tendency to emphasize grief or sorrow and trauma. And the fact of the matter is that there's actually lots of pockets of history where we can point to Jews not only living and surviving, but thriving. If you look at, for example, Poland at one point, right? At one point, Poland, Jews were pretty well taken care of. I mean, you know, relatively speaking, but they were in charge of basically all of alcohol production in Poland. They had money, they ran taverns, they were moving to urban areas, they had protection, they were called, they were Arrendator was the name, and they were in charge of an arenda, which was an area. So they were doing pretty well for themselves. And so Salo Baron points this out, and why I bring that up is that it's funny that these are the pieces of symbols that we take, right? The bitter tears of Pesach, oh, we see salt, that must have to do with that. But who offered the piece about the temple and salting things?
I think it was Robin.
Was that you, was that Robin? Yeah.
I mean, Robin, that's what I've heard.
Yeah,
And friends of mine who are rabbis who've said that, so that we are transporting ourselves to this holy place of the temple.
Absolutely. And so like that's a piece that doesn't necessarily come out because, shocking, I know, I don't mean to bring the mood down, but a lot of people don't know much about what's going on. Like they don't know that history, right? It's much easier to have that emotional piece because not everybody has the
Less
literary.
insider.
Yeah, it's less insider. So that's really interesting.
I was thinking about with challah, and we peel off the piece and burn it, is almost the same kind of.
So challah, we all have our pet peeves. And one of my pet peeves is that we call the loaf challah. The loaf itself is not challah. The loaf is bread. Challah is the thing that we actually don't eat. So in the Torah, it says that when you bake bread, a certain amount of bread, the rabbis talk about that. When you bake bread of a certain quantity, you actually have to remove lehafrish challah. You have to take out the challah. And originally, when you did that, that was actually one of the gifts of the priests. So you would bring that to the priest, or you would, whatever you're going to do with it, and that would be for them. We don't have a temple, so what do you do with it? And so challah is the thing that you take out and you wrap it up, and people actually throw it into the back of their oven and they burn it. So that's lehafrish challah. That's the challah that we're talking about. And the bread that we get out of it is just kosher, which is really, it's like a really funny thing. Now, when we were talking about how our time period tells us how to interpret things, there's not like a really good indicator. It says how much dough in Torah, but the measurements aren't the same. So the rabbis have big arguments about like, well, what do we actually mean by this amount of dough? And they come to different opinions on like what it is, and but it's a very large quantity of dough, and the reason for that is because in that time period it was very expensive. People didn't have ovens in their house. That wasn't a thing that happened. Often the miller and the baker and the candlestick maker, right? They're all in a central area, and so it was much more common to have these huge loaves of or huge quantities of dough that you could actually take out. In a commercial bakery, that's something that would happen. In a home situation, unless you are like a really solid, like you love to bake, you would almost never make that amount of dough, which is really interesting. But we keep that because it's a symbol. We don't have to take it because the temple doesn't exist, but we do as a symbolic representation of what it means to do taking challah. So challah is interesting.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Oh, no. Robin's got another good one about the red string. It's
Particularly in a baby's, like my grandmother would say, to put it by the baby's crib or red on the baby. And then there's obviously the Kabbalistic.
So
What are
yeah,
these
they're actually related. There is a sense that red is associated, and we're going to talk about this. Red is associated with Gevurah, with strength, and so there's a protective element to this, in part because also red, there's the textual support and there's the psychological reality of it, which is to say, red is a symbol of danger, passion, right? Like it can be a lot of those things. So there's a psychological response of protection to red because it sort of means a fierceness. And the Kabbalistic piece of that is that red is associated with this idea of strength and protection in something called Sphira, which we'll talk about what that is momentarily. But yeah, so that is why that's one of the reasons. I'm gonna keep saying that. That's one of the reasons. I'm sure you could find like 10 more reasons that another, a famous rabbi from the 16th century said that we do it because of this. But yeah, so that's that protective measure. And brings up a really important part. Sorry, I'm just reading the.
Oh, is it burned separately from the baked loaf? I think is the question Jeff is asking.
It's the dough is taken before it's baked. Yeah, so it's taken from the raw dough and baked by itself.
It sounds like it's like really like that offering of also people who have leaving a little extra for everyone who doesn't, whether it's the priests or the corners of your field.
Yeah, and that sort of thing. Yeah, that could be definitely part of it. And this is what that brings up, and what the red string piece brings up is we also have sort of the influence of folk tradition mixed with a religious sensibility. So during the a really great example, actually I'll see if I can find a picture of it so I can show you all. So during the Sasanian Empire in
Yes, Jeff.
Babylon and that sort of thing. Sorry, what was the question?
So basically a baked loaf isn't challah at all, it's the non-challah.
Correct.
The challah is the piece.
Correct. Yeah.
So we get a challah and a bread.
The challah has been taken out of it. Yeah, exactly. But we just call it challah, which is like a.
Sit down on hold.
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny. It's like just a funny thing. I love it. So in terms of the red string and folk symbolism, there is in the Sasanian Empire, which is during the exile, right? This is happening in the diaspora. There was a tradition. There was a large tradition of magic in Jewish communities. And what's really interesting about magic in Jewish communities, in this case, is that there's questions about whether or not, as opposed to official thing, like a mezuzah, right, is a symbol, is yes, it's in the Ve'ahavta, right? Like, yes, we say that we're supposed to do this, but we're not gonna kid ourselves and say that this didn't have to do with protection. If you put something on your door, right, a la Exodus from Egypt, God will protect you. That's why it says Shaddai on it. That's why we have these names of God all over the place. There's a magical element to it. But these are largely being produced by men, by rabbis, by literate people. And so what's interesting about, it's called an incantation bowl during the Sasanian Empire, is that these are often pretty crude, right? They're made out of mud, right? Like mud, clay, and things like that, that you would be available in your house, as opposed to more expensive things that you'd have to be a specialized worker. And what they would do is they would make these bowls, and they would actually draw. This was a time period where we're sort of moving away from, but it's still very much present, that like demons are responsible for sickness, right? So like you'll read examples of, you'll read like diagnoses from the time period, and you're like, oh, this person has seizures, right? Like we can hear today and be like, oh, that's an actual like medical issue. But at the time they thought this has to be a demon. And so, sure, I'll take some more coffee. Amazing. Liz coming in with the coffee, love it. Oh, sure, please. So what they would do is they would actually depict the demon in the middle of these bowls, and then they would trap the demon. Thank you so much. They would trap the demon with text, and I'll show you a picture of this really for a second, because it's really cool. Some of them are really wild. Let me see if I can find, I like this one. So this is actually, you can actually go see this one. This is at the Penn Museum. I'm gonna share my screen for a second. There we go. All right. So this is an incantation bowl. And you see, so this actually is not, is it sharing?
No, I'm not seeing it.
Oh no.
Start with the green arrow again.
Coming through for me.
Oh, great, then it's just on my screen, so
Okay.
continue.
So I'll turn this so that,
Oh, I look.
so. Fine. So you can see the little demons in the middle, and then you can see all of the writing around it, and this was meant to do some sort of protective work. And what's interesting about this is, so we can actually, if we zoom in a little bit, it's upside down, but you can see that this is most likely Hebrew. Like we can see, I'll put on my little annotator here so that I can circle things as I'm doing it. No point in the, oh, I don't know if I can annotate more. Oh, okay, I can't annotate, that's okay. But there, like, we'll have a tzadi, we see like a Fei over here, we have an Aleph over here. But what's really interesting is people found these, and they'll be in different languages. Sometimes they'll be in Aramaic, or they'll be in other languages of period, and it's gibberish. It's complete gibberish. It doesn't mean anything. These writings around the side. Sometimes it will say, like, in the name of so and so, the daughter of so and so, may she, may she be healed from the cuts on her, right? Like da 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 da. But often they don't mean anything at all. And so there's a big question about whether or not these were people trying to charge people money by giving them an incantation bowl to protect them. And so, so people were selling these. We have lots of examples of them, and they would actually bury them in the floor of their home. They would bury them upside down because it was sort of like a trap. The demon would crawl up in it, and then it would catch the demon underneath it. But this had really important significance. Like, yes, it symbolized what was happening, but there was also an element of realness to what was going on when you trap these demons. So, any questions coming up for people before I move into the more Kabbalistic-y piece of it? And I'll show a video and stop talking, I promise, in a moment, that will get us kicked off for this part.
Oh, Reno is just,
You
no.
did not. We're about to do Star of David right now. Good timing.
Okay, to read what's in the chat, Robin had the question of, speaking about magic, why does Avada Kedavra sound like abracadabra? Does anyone know where Avada Kedavra came from? It's an ancient spell in Aramaic, and it is the original of abracadabra, which means let the thing be destroyed. Originally, it was used to cure illness, and the thing was the illness.
There you go. I didn't know that. That's very interesting.
A friend of mine did his doctoral dissertation on Jewish magic and symbols.
Oh, that has.
He's the one who taught me that, and then I had copied it on a Google.
Cool.
Nice.
Yeah, Jewish magic is really interesting. For example, how many times does an amulet have to work before you can call it an amulet?
I'm going with 7.
You said 7. That's a really good guess. I wish it were 7. The rabbis were kind on this one. 3 times. It has to work 3 times, and then you can call it an amulet, and you can actually sell it. Jewish magic.
Impress me
Fascinating
once.
stuff. Yeah, impress me once.
Twice.
Yeah. Once is luck. 2 is mistake. 3, you're good.
Yeah.
So, Magen David. Okay. So, what was that?
Oh, you should screen share still. I'm not sure. Just because I don't see it on my screen.
No, I'm not
Okay,
sharing. So Magen David, or what we call Magen David, originally not a Jewish symbol at all. So much in the way that, for example, was it Pythagoras who had the secret club where they would draw the pentagram? Like the pentagram now is associated with witchcraft and the occult, but originally these were people who were really interested in geometry, and there's a lot of interesting sacred geometry stuff around the Magen David. I do not know it. I'm going to be very honest with you. I am not a math person. I'm fascinated, and I love that for you. If you do, I know nothing about it, but I do know that geometrically, people were interested in this idea of the overlapping triangle. But there's questions, scholars question whether or not it actually had any religious significance. It might have just been a decorative element, because we see it in a lot of different places. Actually, sometimes you'll go to a mosque and you'll see it, right? It's sort of all over the place, getting used in a decorative way. The first time that there seems to be a very specific connection is in the 3rd century at Capernaum. They find a synagogue, the ruins of a synagogue, that had a Star of David on it. Again, people are theorizing, is this still decorative? Is it specific? For us, it's hard not to read it specifically, but that question remains. And it continues to get used in this way for a long time, right? It's not one specific context. It's not all communities. But what ends up happening eventually is that it gets in Prague. They actually, the Jews of Prague are allowed to hang a banner. They're allowed to create a flag under the ruler at that time, who's I think Charles in Prague. Sure, I'm blanking on the name. But and so they create a standard, and the standard has the Star of David on it. So this is the first time that it's being specifically adopted in a modern context that we can verify as a Jewish specific thing for a Jewish community. It also gets taken up by the Kabbalists a little bit, which is the connection that I want to bring in here. It gets taken up by the Kabbalists, and it's given some mystical, esoteric kind of meaning as well. But really, what turns the symbol into this is a Jewish symbol is the Zionist movement. The Zionists early on take up this symbol to represent it. There were suggestions of using the menorah, but unlike the menorah, and this makes a lot of sense for the Zionist movement, which had a lot of secular Jews in it, the menorah had a very particular religious meaning in a way that the Star of David did not. And so there were questions about what they should use. And when they were creating the flag of Israel, there were questions about whether they wanted the flag of the state and of the Zionist movement to be the same, because they were worried that if they were sort of put together, that would create problems. But eventually the constituents said that they wanted the Star of David to be on the flag, which is how it happened to be there. So it's actually a much later symbol. The Kabbalists at one point said that the Magen David, Magen means shield, that the Star of David had magical properties, and it was on the shield of David in protecting and ruling Israel. But it's is that true, or are we retrojecting? I mean, I guess do you believe in magic? Yeah, I don't know, maybe you do. But that's definitely what's happening there. Somebody had brought up earlier, and Joey, you cued in for the Seal of Solomon. So there is an indication that the Star of David is also related to the Seal of Solomon. With that, it comes, it also takes on hidden wisdom sort of pieces too, because Solomon is notoriously known as the wise king, right? Solomon was supposedly responsible for a lot of the wisdom literature that's in the Tanakh. Whether or not Solomon actually wrote it, probably not. but that's okay, because it actually doesn't end up mattering too much. It's how we want to associate things.
Since we're sorry, talking symbols and magic, wasn't Solomon didn't his seal was used to seal away demons. That's why it was a big special thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of, right, you have a lot of like when you get to Christian Kabbalah and especially esotericism, a lot of Jewish symbols get sort of taken into those contexts because they are associated with particular things. So yes, the Seal of Solomon, right, is associated with putting away demons. Great superpower to have, I suppose. You know, wish I had it myself, but yeah, so it had this magical element, this element of power, the connection to a king, into history. So it made a lot of sense that it would have a lot of staying power. Was the Solomon seal 5-pointed? I don't think that it was, but I think that might be a later. I think the 5-pointed might be a later piece, but I'm fully prepared to be wrong if that is the case. Because again, it gets tricky when we're talking about what seal are we talking about, what Solomon are we talking about, which, you know, Avada Kedavra, right? Like what are we pointing to, and how are we adapting it? Just as we have adapted symbols, right? Other people later on are also adapting symbols to move things like Kabbalistic understandings into.
Julian's suggesting this is the source possibly of where the pentagram is coming with the association of Western occult.
It very well might be. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. I don't want to say yes or no because I honestly just don't know. Yeah, so the seals, right? The seals were, in this case, part of your
Signet ring. Yep.
signet ring. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, it's a great point, right? So a seal was the thing that you would put into the wax, right? Sort of deal, to make sure that people knew it was you.
Return address label.
Return address label, indeed. Yeah, so I mean, I was surprised about McKen's IV because I was just assumed, you know, this is what it is.
It's just interesting how it was consciously adopted.
Yeah.
And a tad bit of inclusion with it, which is not saying, okay, this is not, by choosing it over the menorah,
right,
as a symbol.
Right. Yeah. And like the menorah is still part of the symbols of Israel, right? It's on the Israeli seal, right? Like the seal of state. So it's not like the menorah was lost completely, but in terms of it makes sense in the idea of nation, right, and nationalism, that we would be more universal in that. So for whatever reason, the constituents said we want that on the flag and not the menorah. So that's what we got to in that way. And if you look at early meetings of the WZO, the World Zionist Organization, you'll see they have the Star of David on the wall, right? It's, you know, it's part of the visual as well as the written history of what we're talking about when we're talking about Israel and the Jewish people. It's up there, it's being used. So I want to go back to the Kabbalists because I think that the Kabbalists, perhaps more than any other, I shouldn't say that. Certainly, they were doing interesting stuff with symbols. And so by way of a foundation, we have to remember that we're talking about a time period in which we still believe very specifically in biblical inerrancy, right? The Bible is correct in every way. It is scientifically, for their understanding of science, it is true. It tells a true thing. It is a source that we can use to understand and indicate basic assumptions about how our world works. And so part of that is we know that there are things that are funky in the Bible. There are things that don't work. There are misspellings. There are there are strange like switches that we don't understand why. So for example, if you look in speaking of high holidays, because they just happened, if you look at the story of Hannah praying for Samuel, you go through the whole thing of her crying, and Ellie comes in and says, "You're drunk." She says, "I'm not drunk, I'm just sad," right? Like it's this whole moment. And then she has the baby, and she says, and she names him Shmuel, because, and just like the Bible does sometimes, where we'll give a name and then we'll say the derivation, like this is the name, and the reason is because it's related to the etymology. The name is not Shmuel. The etymology of the name is Sha'al, which is Saul. So what actually ends up happening is a question of, oh, was this supposed to be Saul's birth story? Now, lots of people come up with reasons why Saul, Shin Aleph Lamed, is the name that's meant here, but it's a little bit odd that this is what gets chosen. And so we look at that and say, oh, scribes, how could you, right? But the Kabbalists are saying, no, this all matters, this is all important. And more than just stories or words, they are interested in something as small as the letter. So what I want to do is, has anybody ever listened to a woman named Victoria Hannah? She is an Israeli music artist who is in the Orthodox community, but she does sort of like cool experimental music, and she does a lot of cool experimental religious music. And so there is an alefbet song, sort of, called Hoshana. Hoshana is related to Sukkot. We do Hoshana Rabbah. So I wanted to share this video with you, so I'm going to make sure that I am sharing sound, because that's not going to do anybody much good if you can't hear it. And as we're listening to it, what I want you to be paying attention to is not just the words. It's in Hebrew, so if you understand Hebrew, don't just pay attention to the words. If you don't understand Hebrew, look at the visual piece, what she's doing with her body as she's singing. So give me 1 second while I go to Victoria. All right, so this is actually called the alefbet song, or Hoshana. So give me 1 second while I cue it up. And it's weird. I'm gonna be really honest with you, very early. It's weird, but it's good.
We're warned.
Will, if my sound is all the way down on my thing,
I'm going.
I'm gonna
Press play.
flag it anyway.
Press play.
Okay, give me 1 second. All right.
We're just gonna lose your voice while I walk around.
Oh no. Liz.
Yes.
Can you still? I think that's no.
What did it
Oh,
say?
there we go. Okay, I'm back. I couldn't see anybody. My computer, the Wi-Fi wasn't working. All right. Can you hear that?
I am not getting sound. I'm not getting sound over here.
What was that?
I'm not getting sound.
You're not getting sound. We good? All right.
alefbet gimel dalet he vav zayin he tet yud kaf lamed mem nun samach ayin pe tzadik kuf resh shin taf alef taf abagadav zahataka lamana sapat zakar shadaa obogodov zohoto kolomona sopat zakor shadaa
stop share. Oh, nope, that's what I wanted to do. Oh, computers, so helpful, so not helpful. So, yes, you can see that stop share. Okay, great. So, I'm gonna ask, what did you see going on there?
Just so much like physical representation of the letters with their arms and things like that. So shaping,
Okay.
but then also spirals and the branches. And
Yeah, oh, I see 2 more, 3 more.
Rachel is the tree at the end.
Joy, did you share this with me? I remember something that was lovely. The tree creation. Yeah, it's use location
Oh.
students for the vowel markings at least once. Cool.
That's a good catch.
Yeah, I love. For a long time, I was like, oh, that's so cool. I'll never be able to memorize it. And then I just realized that she was going through the alphabet with a different vowel each time. I was like, oh, abagadabaza hatakala manasa patakara, right? And then ububuzubuzuhus, right? It sounds really cool, but it's sort of the same thing. But if you look, part of what's happening is she's right, like alefbet, dalet, hey, right, and she's touching different parts of her body, and then ta, right? So it's one of those things where if you're not in the know about what's happening here, you're just like, oh, it's a really cool choreography and like an interesting, this ain't Debbie Friedman's alefbet, that's for sure, right? But what's actually happening here is that she is representing a Kabbalistic text. So this text actually comes from our proto, like an early Kabbalistic text called Sefer Yetzirah. And so Sefer Yetzirah is the book of creation or the book of formation. And Sefer Yetzirah was connected with this idea. It said that, for example, in Prague, the Golem, the rabbi who made the Golem, learned how to do this from the Sefer Yetzirah, right? So there's this again, this magical piece to it. And so I wanted to show the part where it's talking about this because I think it's pretty cool. Because we often forget that letters themselves are symbols, right? We forget that they're symbols, and not just any symbols, they're actually important symbols. And for the Kabbalists, the letters themselves are the material from which the world is made, right? Everything is made of letters, the word. And so I'm going to share this. So this is a selection in translation from the Sefer Yetzirah. So we have all of the, right, so 3 primary letters, Aleph, Mem, Shin. Their basis is the scale of acquittal and the scale of guilt, and the language of law holds the balance between them. Aleph, Mem, Shin, a great secret, hidden and ineffable and sealed with 6 seals, and from it, out of fire, water, and air, and it is wrapped up in male and female. Obviously, this is a binary time. Know and ponder and form a mental image that fire evaporates water. Right? This is a wild, wild text. And right, it's actually really beautiful. If we read it from as poetry, more so than
Dictionary.
Then like, yeah, it can tell us a lot, right? So if we look down here, what they'll also do is they'll put letters together, and in their understanding, all of the letters together are one name of God, but you can put any 3 letters together, and that's a different name of God, right? So if you've heard of this idea of 72 names of God, this is partially where this is coming from. And so 3 primary letters, Aleph, Mem, Shin. There was formed with Aleph, spirit, air, humidity, the chest, law, and the tongue or language, and with Mem, earth, cold, the belly, and the scale of acquittal. There were formed with Shin, heaven, heat, the head, and the scale of guilt. This is Aleph, Mem, Shin, the end.
I like that.
Right? Very specific. Yeah, the end.
This guy's like, I'm done. We're done talking.
I'm done. Yeah, I'm done with that piece of it. And so we get all of this stuff about how the letters are interacting, how are they working together, how are they not. If you are particularly interested in the sort of the the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Oh my gosh, like astrology, like zodiac. That is also part of it. So if we go down here, these are the 7 planets in the universe: Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, and the 7 days, the 7 days of creation. And the 7 apertures in mankind: 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and a mouth. And the 7 firmaments. So the firmaments were like
Interlocking spheres.
Yeah, have you heard of the 7th heaven? Like that whole idea, or the 9th sphere, right? So this idea that there's actually layers of stratosphere around the earth, and each of them have their own sort of piece. That's part of it. And we get into the double letters like Bet and Gimel and Dalet and so on. There's formed with Bet, Saturn, the Sabbath, the mouth. With Gimel, we get the right eye. With Dalet, we get Mars and wisdom and folly in the left eye, right? So they are mapping these huge cosmological symbols from the body to the very structure of the universe. And what connects them all is that they're actually all coming out of letters, not just as symbols, but as real material, right? So they can be both things. They're the thing that we write with, but they're also the actual the building blocks, the atoms, right, that make us who we are. And so this is early Kabbalah, and so everything that comes after this, right, is in many ways tied to this and has the same sort of esoteric symbolism going on. And we're not going to have a ton of time to go through it today, but I think that what ends up happening is that these get distilled into what are called the Sephirot. So Sephirot gets translated in a lot of different ways, but the idea of a Sephirah is that it's sort of a space, and it's actually because of our inability to represent endlessness that we represent them as sort of these like
finite
like little like spheres, right? We hear Sephirah, we hear sphere. But they're not. They're actually all up in it. I used to do an activity with my Sunday school where we wrote our names in Hebrew and then counted up the magic number associated with their name. Yeah, absolutely. Gematria. Yeah, gematria. So letters are not, and that's a great point. Letters aren't just material, they're also numbers, right? So they don't just describe the relationship of sounds, they relate or objects, they also show us the relationship numerically, which gets used all over the place. The rabbis of the Kabbalah, as well as earlier, so if you look at the pietistic movements in Germany in the 15th century, they're really smart in a way that like it's hard for me to wrap my head around knowing something quite that well. But were we talking about this last week, like cultural things that we can just say and people know what you're talking about, right? Like if I said, oh, I'm trying to think of a good example that would fit for everybody on the call right now.
Like an idiom where it's if you're in, you know, and you're out, you don't.
Yeah, like it's like
I said to Armin one day, Armin is a native speaker of German, and I said, okay, great, go to town. And he said, yes, I will go to town.
Okay, yes.
Just as a simple, like, to a native English speaker in America, that means go for it. But
Yes.
otherwise,
Absolutely. Well, and so there's that piece of it, like
Yeah.
the idiomatic piece, and then there's for some reason the only thing that's coming to my head is if I say, I don't know if you've seen Mean Girls, but there's a part in Mean Girls when she says, "Get in, loser, we're going shopping." Now, if you don't know that text, that does "Get in, loser, we're going to therapy." Yeah. So if you don't know that text, then it's not gonna mean the same thing.
Oh.
So mezuzah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you give me like a couple? What do you mean by that?
What are you talking about on the doorpost or around your neck from taking it from the Shema, the Hafta?
Yes.
That what you're talking about? That
You
most Jews would know that that's what I would hope what it comes from.
Yeah.
So yeah, but what I mean to say is not just that you can recognize the symbol, but you know it so well that you could start especially textually, you could start anywhere in the text and you would know exactly what I'm talking about.
And look at that.
So if I, oh, okay, so if I say, had a little, what am I singing?
Cradle.
Oh, so it does sound like I'm saying dreidel. Did I have bad, that's the problem. If I say little lamb,
Mm.
what does that make you think of? Who had it?
Mary.
Great,
There.
okay, you just knew that, right? These are common cultural things. So they knew the Siddur, they knew Torah, they knew the Tanakh so well that they could say, ah, yes, da da da. And everyone they could basically tell you what page it was on, right? Like that's how well they knew what they were talking about. And so when you know something that well, what tends to happen after a while, do you think?
Confusion?
Confusion?
Blurring, like blurring of, wait, was that this or is that that or was that separate?
Oh, okay.
Like,
So,
over
that's interesting.
familiarity
Okay, if you're over
leads to-
familiar, yeah. So you could get bored.
Riffing with it.
Yes, great. So you start, often you'll get bored and you start figuring out, well, how can I tinker with this a little bit more? And so there's actually examples, there's texts that talk about like really gifted rabbis. Actually, they start counting like the number of alephs in a text, right? Or tabs, or they do, right? And so they're boredom is maybe not the best word, but this idea of it's so familiar that they want to find something new in it. And that leads to pietistic, to piety practices that are even more stringent. And the Kabbalists, yes, they do that, but it comes from this much more literary, poetic outpouring of really deep symbolism and emotional connection. For the Kabbalists, what they're most interested in is they're interested in total unification of the Kabbalist, of the prayer with God.
You guys want to set the alarm? and
Yeah,
phone
absolutely. Just this side though. It's good over there
Yeah,
already?
taken care of.
Perfect. Thank you. Jen.
Not necessarily God, because God for them is sort of unknowable, but specifically the Shekhinah, the feminine emanation of God in their understanding. So probably the best 0.22222222. Probably the best example of this is or best representation of the Sefirot is the tree diagram. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share that tree. You can find this on Safaria. And actually, if it's easier for you to look at it on your own screen, you don't want to do share, I'll put it in the chat so that people can see it, or go to that page, I should say. Give me 1 second while I go to everyone in the meeting. There you go. I'm still going to share just in case people can't see. So this is one representation of the Sefirot. And what I like to, for a long time, I didn't realize this, but we actually sing the second part of the Sefirot. So not the top three kingdom, like the top three, which are Keter and Chochmah and Binah. We actually sing the bottom portion during the Torah service. We sing, so it will only make sense if I show you that Chesed, which is kindness, which is one of these Sefirot, is also called Gedula. And so, yes, Lecha Adonai HaGedula VeHaGivura, which is also Din, VeHaTiferet, which is Chesed and Gevura together, VeHaNetzach VeHaHod. So we actually sing the middle Sefirot as part of our liturgy. It's so built into what we're doing. So really broadly, because this is people spend their lives devoted to this, and I have only just started studying a lot of it myself. Oh, I saw something in the chat.
Rich said, so cool.
So cool, yeah, it is so cool. It makes me happy every time. So Keter, crown. I got ahead of myself because I was so excited. So we talked about the firmaments, this idea of sort of stratospheres upon stratospheres in our understanding of the world. So where we actually start is called Ein, right? There is not. Or Ein Sof, there is not an ending. So the idea of assigning God either one type of material, like of being, or a finiteness is impossible for them. So outside all of this is this idea of the Ein Sof, that which is endless. It sounds like a science fiction film, but it is. You know, this is what we have. Originally, there is nothing. The top three, Keter, which is crown, Chochmah, which is wisdom, and Bina, which is understanding, are not really accessible to us in this way. And in fact, Keter, we really don't have access to. The only thing is it's associated with the letter Yud, and not the entire letter. It's actually the tiniest little dot, which here gets said primordial point, right? It is the smallest point of the Yud that turns into Chochmah, into wisdom. And wisdom is associated usually with masculinity in their understanding of it. And it's actually talked about this idea that the letters of creation, the alefbet, turn into the, I'm going to be very honest, seminal fluid that actually gives birth through Bina, the nurturing womb, to create the world. And while I'm not super into that imagery, this is how they talk about it. There's an eroticism about these symbols that they are very okay with. And I think that that's something that we don't always see in Jewish texts. It's not symbols that we often feel comfortable in the same way with. You know, when you think about the eroticism of creation, right, of Adam and Chava, right, that is a really suspect kind of eroticism. The nakedness there is a bad thing. And here it is not. Here it is actually generative and meaningful.
And all of them are in relation to each other. None of them are separate. Nothing is without a pairing or a balance or a pendulum swing of dualities between, what, 13?
Yes.
Yeah. 8, 9, 10.
Well, and so it gets talked about in different ways, right? It's like, well, it's this, like 8 is actually the 7 and 1, right? Or something like that. They'll do weird things like that. But so these three, so energy is coming down from the Ein Sof, and it's moving through these different pieces, and it goes through Chesed and Gevurah. And you can see that Chesed and Gevurah are associated not only with attributes, but also colors and parts of the body. And I'll just show you really briefly. This is one version of mapping the Sefirot onto the body. You can see Keter at the top with the crown. So this is just one version of it. So these things start to get associated with the body as well.
Elbows, shoulders, knees.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even, right, Netzach and Hod, which are, Netzach is they call it endurance, but it's actually like, they don't talk a lot about Netzach and Hod because it has to do with prophecy, and they're like a little bit skeptical about that. But love is associated with Abraham, and power gets associated with Isaac, and Tiferet is actually these two symbols together in the form of Moses and in the form of Jacob, because Jacob becomes, Yaakov becomes who? Israel. Yeah. Right? So we can't be too much love and we can't be too much power. We have to temper that with mercy. And so that's how Tiferet comes in. Down here at the bottom, we have Yesod, and Yesod is often associated, it says it right here, with the phallus, right? So again, we have this masculinity piece. And Malchut, which is the Shekhinah. So this idea of we're always trying to unify, and for them, a heterosexual paradigm is what they mean by unification often, which is a little troublesome because it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but do what you got to do.
Yeah.
Do what you got to do, Kabbalists, because for them, that's how they understood it. And we have to remember their context, which is that was how they understood. I think Tiferet is associated with Jacob, but Netzach with Moses.
Okay.
So this is from Essential Zohar, which is part of the Pritzker edition.
Link will be in the email.
Link will be in the email. Yeah. what you will soon find, so you can see down here, Jacob and Moses both get associated with Tiferet in this particular thing. It's not an exact science. You can go from one Kabbalistic text to another, and they're going to associate different things with different pieces, right? This is a symbol system that is very complicated and often very personal. So you very well might be, you could find something that associates that with Netzach, yeah. The Pritzker edition is an English translation, and actually we're very lucky. Joel Hecker, Dr. Joel Hecker, Rabbi Doctor, who is my mysticism and medieval professor, is right down at the Reconstructionist. He translated volumes of the Pritzker edition. He's brilliant, very, very brilliant. And he talks about this all the time, this idea of like, is it this, is it this? Yes, right? That's sort of how he views a lot of things, which is frustrating at times, but interesting nonetheless. And so what I wanted to end with is, because it's almost 2:30 and I feel like I've been talking your ear off, but I was so excited to offer all this stuff, and we didn't even get to a third of what I had brought because I got so excited, is that how does this show up elsewhere in our lives, or how can we use it in our lives? How does it show up in our prayer book, in our prayer, in our liturgy, and how are we bring kavanah meaning to what it is? So if you look at Shema, it's not on this particular form, but I'm going to stop sharing this for a second. So it's not on this particular diagram, but the Sephirot also get associated with particular names of God. So you have things like Adonai Tzevaot, you have Yud He Vav He, you have Elohim, you have Elohe, right? Yah. All of these different names of God get associated with different aspects of God's presence in Torah and in our lives. So the Shema, so if we say Shema Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kavod Nachuto Leolam Va'ed. In the two first lines, right, Adonai and Eloheinu, we actually have Adonai has to do with Chesed, and Eloheinu has to do with judgment. And together, we're actually unifying them when we say the Shema, right? We're unifying attributes of God in order to bring Tiferet, in order to bring beauty, and sort of that relationship. Going back to the comment about gematria, there are supposedly, depending on which text you're looking at, the Shema in its entirety, not just the short Shema, but the Shema with the other paragraphs that we would usually say. There are supposed to be 248 words, unique words, which is how many parts of the body the rabbis believe we had. But if you do, it actually, there's only 245. So what ends up happening is they say, well, there's a short phrase that you would say at the beginning of Shema, somewhat quietly or silently, that brings it up to 248. Or we say out loud, Adonai Elohe, or Adonai Elohe. Yes. Sorry, I was like having brain freeze. So this is an example of, again, using numbers and letters and names and symbols in our liturgy to sort of bring this all together to unify our spiritual and our literal, like the 248 parts of our physical body with our understanding of attributes of God. And so I'm glad we got to talk about Magen David and all those pieces. But I want to encourage you, your time is almost up. I hope
yes, it will be. We're going to put all the links together, and I'll have a link to the recording. So it will all come out in the next couple days.
Yes. Yeah. What prayer from Shabbat was the Sephirot you saying? That
when
comes,
the Torahs walked around the room.
Yes, that's part of the Hakafah for the Torah scroll. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm gonna put all this up there. Some of it will just be a link
Bonus, yeah.
because it's available on,
Oh, this is Julian's note sharing with us. Thank you so much.
great, yes.
Everybody can copy that if they need to paste it into something else. Oh, wait, this is. Oh, wow, great questions in here. Okay, a lot of stuff. Awesome stuff.
Awesome.
I was also thinking of this counting of the Omer practice that I had encountered through a meditation group. And I have no idea how common it is, but it's taking the Sephirot, making a chart, some across the top, and then the same down across the side, and drawing. Okay, today is the intersection of Hesed and Tiferet.
Yes.
So today we meditate on the combination of these two things and what that means in my life. And then the next day is the second combination. It leads up to 49. So on the 50th day is Shavuot. But that was the first time I'd encountered that was just a couple years ago. And
No, that's a very,
it's a very in-depth, like it requires you to really sit and ponder a lot of things. I thought it was really interesting practice.
Yeah, I go to school with somebody who has earrings for all of them, and will wear the different earrings so that you know which day
Green
of
and
the
yellow.
Omer we are. So it will be like Gevura should be hod, right? Like, what does it mean to have power in prophecy, right? Like, it's like a very interesting sort of way to count.
Oh, and Joy's mentioning the workbooks and stuff.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful practice, and it's becoming a lot more common in more areas. But yeah, it's a mystical practice. It's very interesting. I'll only add for a moment for those who are interested in, like, if you look at some, because we've been talking a little bit about magical practices. If you're interested in like the sort of Jungian, like crone, maiden, mother, like these sort of pieces. So when you eventually get to Lurianic Kabbalah, there are sort of like personae of God that also come into this. And what he does is he says that in every sphera, you have all of these pieces together. Thanks, Jess. You have all these pieces together, and it's like a fractal. So it's like within each sephirah, but also within the whole sephiradic tree. So yeah, Lurianic Kabbalah gets wild. There's the wise man, the bitter man, so you get all of these things. Yeah, the Shekinah is usually there because we gotta, balance out all the
A little bit of it.
So-
Just a little bounce.
So I want to thank you for giving me the 3 minutes, and for those who have to go, thank you so much for joining. I know that's a lot of information, and maybe I didn't touch enough on the symbolism that you wanted. If you have stuff that you want me to follow up on, I'm happy to do it.
We can always throw another class on the schedule for, we're always looking for class topics. So if anybody has something burning passions that you want to learn about, you can send us ideas too. And that's great.
Part two, yeah.
Part two.
If you want a field full of rabbit holes, welcome to Jewish symbolism, right? But no, thank you. This is a lot of fun to prepare, just because it's wild. We got some wild stuff. So.
Oh, Robin's coming from LA. All right, great. Nice. Yeah, I'm glad everybody. Julian's saying we could do a whole course on it. Yeah.
You could. You 100% we could. Part two. Oh yeah. Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
We can do this.
We can talk about that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thanks everybody. Really appreciate it. And thank you for. Oh, you're from South and UK.
Oh, UK.
Wow,
all right.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you for joining. And thank you for offering those tidbits. I love learning as much as I love learning from y'all because we're all one person. We can only read so much. So I really appreciate it because it helps me sort of just get even more context. So I really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording. Have a fabulous